All right, John Bunyan wrote a book called The Pilgrim's Progress. It's been translated into 200 languages. I'm told it's the most read book on the planet, with the exception of the Holy Bible. I want to read, starting with, I've got the Moody Classic version. I'm told there's different versions, but I have the Moody Classic version. I'm going to start with page 116, the section titled Vanity Fair. I want you guys to keep Schaeffer Cox in your thoughts and what's happened to Schaeffer Cox as I read these sections. Then I saw in my dream that when they were got out of the wilderness, they presently saw a town before them. And the name of that town is Vanity. And at the town there is a fair kept, called Vanity Fair. It is kept all the year long. It beareth the name of Vanity Fair, because the town where it is kept is lighter than vanity. Psalm 62:9. And also because all that is there sold, or that cometh thither, is vanity. As is the saying of the wise, all that cometh is vanity. Ecclesiastes 11:8. See also 1:2 through 14, 2:11 through 17, and Isaiah 40:17. This fair is no new erected business, but a thing of ancient standing. I will show you the original of it. Almost 5,000 years ago there were pilgrims walking to the celestial city, as these two honest persons are. The two people that are currently walking, just to give you a little bit of background, I believe are named Christian and Faithful. So that's the two people that it's referring to. Almost 5,000 years ago, there were pilgrims walking to the celestial city, as these two honest persons are, Christian and Faithful. Beelzebub, Apollyon, and Legion, with their companions, perceiving by the path that the pilgrims made, that their way to the city lay through this town of Vanity, they contrived here to set up a fair wherein should be sold all sorts of vanity, and that it should last all the year long. Therefore at this fair are all such merchandise sold as houses, lands, trades, places, honors, preferments, titles, countries, kingdoms, lust, pleasures, and delights of all sorts, as harlots, wives, husbands, children, masters, servants, lives, blood, bodies, souls, silver, gold, pearls, precious stones, and what not. And moreover at this fair there is at all times to be seen juggling, cheats, games, plays, fools, apes, knaves, and rogues, and that of every kind. Here are to be seen too, and that for nothing, thefts, murder, adulteries, false swears, and that of a blood-red color. And as in other fairs of less moment, there are the several rows and streets under the proper names, where such and such wares are vended. So here likewise you have the proper places, rows, streets, namely countries and kingdoms, where the wares of this fair are soonest to be found. Here is the Britain row, the French row, the Italian row, the Spanish row, the German row, where several sorts of vanities are to be sold. But as in other fairs, some one commodity is as the chief of all the fair. So the ware of Rome and her merchandise is greatly promoted in this fair. Only our English nation, with some others, have taken a dislike thereat. Now, as I said, the way to the celestial city lies through this town, where this lusty fair is kept, and he that would go to the city and yet not go through this town must needs go out of the world. 1 Corinthians 5:10. The prince of princesses himself, when here, went through this town to his own country, and that upon a fair day too. Yea, and as I think, it was Beelzebub, the chief lord of this fair, that invited him to buy of his own vanities. Yea, would have made him lord of the fair, would he but have done him reverence, as he went through the town. Yea, because he was such a person of honor, Beelzebub had him from street to street, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a little time, that he might, if possible, allure that blessed one to cheapen, and by some of his vanities. But he had no mind to the merchandise, and therefore left the town without laying out so much as one farthing upon these vanities. Matthew 4, 8 through 10, Luke 4, 5 through 8. This fair, therefore, is an ancient thing of long standing, and a very great fair. Now these pilgrims, as I said, must needs go through this fair. Well, so they did, but behold, even as they entered into the fair, all the people in the fair were moved, and the town itself, as it were, in a hubbub about them, and that for several reasons. 4. First, the pilgrims were clothed with such kind of raiment as was diverse from the raiment of any that traded in the fair. The people, therefore, of the fair made a great gazing upon them. Some said they were fools, some said they were bedlams, and some they were outlandish men. Job 12:4, 1 Corinthians 4:9. Second, and as they wondered at their apparel, so they did likewise at their speech. For few could understand what they said. They naturally spoke the language of Canaan, but they that kept the fair were the men of this world, so that from one end of the fair to the other they seemed barbarians each to the other. 1 Corinthians 2, 7 through 8. Third, but that which did not a little amuse the merchandisers was that the pilgrims were set very light by all their wares. They cared not so much as to look upon them, and if they called upon them to buy, they would put their fingers in their ears and cry, "Turn away mine eyes from beholding vanity." Psalm 119:37, and look upward, signifying that their trade and traffic was in heaven. Philippians 3:20 through 21. One chanced mockingly, beholding the carriage of the men, to say unto them, "What will ye buy?" But they, looking gravely upon him, said, "We buy the truth." Proverbs 23:23. And that there was an occasion taken to despise the men the more, some mocking, some taunting, some speaking reproachfully, and some calling upon others to smite them. At last things came to a hubbub and a great stir in the fair, insomuch that all order was confounded. Now was word presently brought to the great one of the fair, who quickly came down and deputed some of his most trusty friends to take those men into examination, about whom the fair was almost overturned. Now, as I read this and it talks about the one who is in charge of the fair getting his most trusted friends to bring into custody Christian and faithful, I'm thinking about FBI Special Agent Richard Sutherland, Sergeant Trooper Scott Johnson, FBI Special Agent Sandra Klein, Government Informant Bill Fulton, Government Informant Aaron Bennett, Government Informant Chris Menino, Government Informant $300,000 whore Gerald J.R. Olson. The next section is titled Arrest and Examination. So the men were brought to examination, and they that sat upon them asked whence they came, whither they went, and what they did there in such an unusual garb. The men told them that they were pilgrims and strangers in the world, and that they were going to their own country, which was the heavenly Jerusalem, Hebrews 11:13 through 16, and that they had given no occasion to the men of the town, nor yet to the merchandisers, thus to abuse them, and to let them in their journey, except it was for that. When one asked them what they would buy, they said they would buy the truth. But they that were appointed to examine them did not believe them to buy any other than bedlams and mad, or else such as came to put all things into a confusion in the fair. Therefore they took them and beat them and besmeared them with dirt, and then put them into the cage, that they might be made a spectacle to all the men of the fair. The pilgrims are put into a cage. There, therefore, they lay for some time, and were made the objects of any man's sport, or malice, or revenge, the great one of the fair laughing still at all that befell them. But the men being patient, and not rendering railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, and giving good words for bad, and kindness for injuries done, some men in the fair that were more observing and less prejudiced than the rest began to check and blame the baser sort for their continual abuses done by them to the men. They therefore in angry manner let fly at them again, counting them as bad as the men in the cage, and telling them that they seemed confederates, and should be made partakers of their misfortunes. The others replied that for aught they could see, the men were quiet and sober, and intended nobody any harm, and that they were many that traded in their fare, that were worthier to be put in the cage, yea, and pillory too. And then were the men that, and pillory too, then were the men that they had abused. Thus, after diverse words had passed on both sides, the men behaving themselves all the while very wisely and soberly before them, they fell to some blows, and did harm to one another. Then were these two poor men brought before their examiners again, and they're charged as being guilty of the late hubbub that they had been in the fair. So they beat them pitifully. I'm going to change the page, but it does talk about a remnant of the fair that stood up for the two men in the cage, and they actually got into physical blows with the people at Vanity Fair. The people who stood up for the people in the cage would be what I consider Gideon's army. I've got good friends that I would put in that category. So I'll continue to read Pilgrim's Progress. So they beat them pitifully, and hanged irons upon them, and led them in chains up and down the fair for an example and terror to the others, lest any should speak in their behalf, or join themselves unto them. But Christian and Faithful behaved themselves yet more wisely, and received the ignominy and shame that was cast upon them, with so much meekness and patience that it won to their side, though but few in comparison of the rest, several of the men in the fair. This put the other party yet into a greater rage, insomuch that they concluded the death of these two men. Wherefore they threatened that neither cage nor irons should serve their turn, but that they should die for the abuse they had done, and for deluding the men of the fair. Then were they remanded to the cage again, until further order should be taken with them. So they put them in, and made their feet fast in the stocks. Here therefore they called again to mind what they had heard from their faithful friend evangelist, and were the more confirmed in their way and sufferings by what he told them would happen to them. They also now comforted each other, that whose lot it was to suffer, even he should have the best of it. Therefore each man secretly wished that he might have the preferment, but committing themselves to the all-wise disposal of him that ruleth all things, with much content they abode in the condition in which they were, until they should be otherwise disposed of. The next section is the trial. Then a convenient time being appointed, they brought them forth to their trial in order to their condemnation. When the time was come, they were brought before their enemies and arraigned. The judge's name was Lord Hategood. I would call that Judge Robert Bryan. Their indictment was one and the same in substance, though somewhat varying in form. The content whereof was this, that they were enemies to and disturbers of the trade, and that they had made the commotions and divisions in the town, and had won a party to their own most dangerous opinions, in contempt of the law of their prince. Then Faithful began to answer that he had only set himself against that which had set itself against him, that is, higher than the highest. Faithful. And as for disturbance, I make none, being myself a man of peace. The parties that were won to us were won by beholding our truth and innocence, and they are only turned from the worse to the better. And as to the king you talk of, since he is Beelzebub, the enemy of our Lord, I defy him and all his angels. Then proclamation was made that they had ought to say for their lord the king against the prisoner at the bar should forthwith appear and give in their evidence. So there came in 3 witnesses, to wit, Envy, Superstition, and Pickthank. When I think of this, I think of Yvonne Lamoureux, Stephen E. Scrocky, and Joseph Bottini. They were then asked if they knew the prisoner at the bar and what they had to say for their lord, the king, against him. Then stood forth Miss Yvonne Lamoureux, Envy, and said to this effect, Envy, my lord, I have known this man a long time, and will attest upon oath before the honorable bench that he is. Judge Robert Bryan, hold, give her oath. So they swear her. Then she said, Envy Yvonne Lamoureux, my lord, this man, notwithstanding his plausible name, is one of the vilest men in our country. He neither regardeth prince nor people, law nor custom, but doth all that he can to possess all men, and certain of his disloyal notions, which he in the general calls principles of the faith and holiness. And in particular, I heard him once myself affirm that Christianity and the customs of our town Vanity were diametrically opposite, and could not be reconciled. By which saying, my lord, he doth at once not only condemn all of our laudable doings, but us in the doing of them. The judge, hast thou any more to say? Envy, my lord, I could say much more, only I would not be tedious to the court. Yet if need be, when the other gentlemen have given in their evidence, rather than anything shall be wanting that will dispatch him, I will enlarge my testimony against him. So she was bid stand by. Then they called Superstition Yvonne Lamoureux. Stephen Scrocky. Then they called Superstition Stephen Scrocky, and bid him look upon the prisoner at the bar. They also asked what he could say for their lord the king against him. Then they swear him. So he began, Stephen Scrocky, Superstition. My lord, I have no great acquaintance with this man, nor do I desire to have further knowledge of him. However, this I know, that he is a very pestilent fellow, from some discourse the other day that I had with him in this town. For then, talking with him, I heard him say that our religion was not, and such by which a man could by no means please God. Which saying of his, my lord, your lordship very well knows what necessarily thence will follow, to it, that we still do worship in vain, are yet in our sins, and finally shall be damned. And this is that which I have to say. Then was Pickthank Joseph Bottini sworn, and bid say that he knew in behalf of their lord the king against the prisoner at the bar. Joseph W. Bottini Pickthank, my lord and you gentlemen all, this fellow I have known of a long time, and heard him speak things that ought not to be spoken, for he hath railed on our noble Prince Beelzebub, and hath spoken contemptibly of his honorable friends, whose names are the Lord Old Man, the Lord Carnal Delight, the Lord Luxurious, and the Lord Desire of Vainglory, my old Lord Lechery, Sir Having Greedy, with all the rest of our nobility. And he hath said, moreover, that if all men were of his mind, if possible, there is not one of these noblemen should have any longer a being in this town. Besides, he hath not been afraid to rail on you, my lord, who are now appointed to be his judge, calling you an ungodly villain, with many other such like vilifying terms, with which he hath bespattered most of the gentry of our town. When this Joseph W. Bottini Pickthank had told his tale, the judge directed his speech to the prisoner at the bar, saying, Judge Robert Bryan, thou runagate, heretic, and traitor, hast thou heard what these honest gentlemen have witnessed against thee? Faithful. May I speak a few words in my own defense? Judge Robert Bryan, Sirrah, thou deservest to live no longer, but to be slain immediately upon the place. Yet that all men may see our gentleness toward thee, let us hear what thou hast to say. Faithful. 1. I say, then, in answer to what Mr. Envy has spoken, I never said aught but this, that what rule or laws or customs or people were flat against the word of God are diametrically opposite to Christianity. If I have said amiss in this, convince me of my error, and I am ready here before you to make my recantation. 2. As to the second, to wit, Mr. Superstition, and his charge against me, I said only this, that in the worship of God there is required a divine faith, but there can be no divine faith without a divine revelation of the will of God. Therefore, whatever is thrust into the worship of God that is not agreeable to divine revelation cannot be done but by human faith, which faith will not be profitable to eternal life. Number 3. As to what Mr. Pickthink has said, I say, avoiding terms as that I said to rail and the like, that the prince of this town, with all the rabblement by his attendants, by the gentleman named, are more fit for a being in hell than in this town and country. And so the Lord have mercy upon me. The judge's charge. Then the judge called to the jury, who all the while stood by to hear and observe. Judge, gentlemen of the jury, you see this man about whom so great an uproar hath been made in this town. You have also heard that these worthy gentlemen have witnessed against him, and you have heard his reply and confession. It lieth now in your breast to hang him or save his life, but yet I think meet to instruct you in our law. There was an act made in the days of Pharaoh the great servant to our prince, that lest those of a contrary religion should multiply and grow too strong for him, their males should be thrown into the river. Exodus 1:22. There was also an act made in the days of Nebuchadnezzar the great, another of his servants, that whosoever would not fall down and worship his golden image should be thrown into the fiery furnace. Daniel 3:6. There was also an act made in the days of Darius, that whoso for some time called upon any god but him should be cast into the lion's den. Daniel 6:7. Now for the substance of these laws, this rebel has broken, not only in thought, which is not to be borne, but also in word and deed, which must therefore needs be intolerable. For that of Pharaoh his law was made upon a supposition to prevent mischief, no crime being yet apparent, but here is a crime apparent. For the second and third, you see he disputeth against our religion, and for the treason that he hath confessed, he deserveth to die the death. The jury. Then went out the jury, whose names were Mr. Blindman, Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Lovelust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, Mr. Hatelight, and Mr. Implacable, who everyone gave in his private verdict against him among themselves, and afterward unanimously concluded to bring in him guilty before the judge. And first among themselves Mr. Blindman, the foreman, said, Blindman, I see clearly that this man is a heretic, no good. Away with such a fellow from the earth. Malice, aye, for I hate the very look of him. Love lust, I could never endure him. Live loose, nor I, for he would always be condemning my way. Heady, hang him, hang him. High mind, a sorry scrub. Enmity, my heart riseth against him. Liar, he is a rogue. Cruelty, hanging is too good for him. Hate light, let us dispatch him out of the way. Implacable, might I have all the world given me, I could not be reconciled to him. Therefore let us forthwith bring him in guilty of death. And so they did. Therefore he was presently condemned to be had from the place where he was, to the place from whence he came, and there to be put to the most cruel death that could be invented. The next section of Pilgrim's Progress, and the last section that I will read, is called Faithful's Martyrdom. Keep in mind there was two people on trial, Christian and Faithful. They therefore brought him out to do with him according to their law. First they scourged him, then they buffeted him, then they lanced his flesh with knives. After that they stoned him with stones, then pricked him with their swords. Last of all they burned him to ashes at the stake. Thus came Faithful to his end. Now I saw that there stood behind the multitude a chariot and a couple of horses waiting for Faithful, who, so soon as his adversaries had dispatched him, was taken up into it, and straightway was carried up through the clouds with the sound of a trumpet, the nearest way to the celestial gate. But as for Christian, he had some respite, and was remanded back to prison. So he there remained for a space. But he who overrules all things, having the power of their rage in his own hand, so wrought it about that Christian for that time escaped them and went his way. And as he went, he sang, saying, Well, faithful, thou hast faithfully professed unto thy Lord, with whom thou shalt be blessed. When faithless ones with all their vain delights are crying out under their hellish plights, sing, faithful, sing, and let thy name survive. For they killed thee, thou art yet alive.